The crowbar slipped twice before it bit. Wren Calloway braced her boot against the baseboard and threw her weight into it a third time, and the old iron hinge gave with a groan that seemed to travel up through the floor and into her teeth. Dust sifted down from the rafters, gold and slow in the beam of her flashlight, which she'd wedged between her chin and shoulder because she'd run out of hands 20 minutes ago. Somewhere above her, wind found a gap in the roof slats and made a sound like a low whistle, thin and tuneless, and didn't stop. The safe was smaller than she'd expected. Squat, black, bolted into the floor joists beneath what used to be the station master's ticket counter, its face gone rust orange, except where her prying had scraped it silver. There was no combination dial left, just a keyhole and a handle frozen solid, and she had exactly one flashlight, one crowbar, and no idea what she'd find if she actually got it open. She hadn't told anyone she was doing this tonight. There wasn't anyone to tell. Her hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. 4 days ago she'd had $38, a duffel bag, and a legal notice with her own name typed on it in a county clerk's font, informing her that she was now the owner of a half-collapsed train depot 2 hours from anywhere. Tonight she had all of that, minus $6, the price she'd paid for it, plus a crowbar she'd borrowed and not yet returned, and a locked safe that hadn't been touched, as far as she could tell, in longer than she'd been alive. She got the handle to turn. It stuck, screamed, and then swung. Wren didn't move for a second. Then she angled the flashlight down, and what the beam caught made her breath go short. A glint of something wrapped in oilcloth, stacked, deliberate, not the way anyone stores garbage. Beneath it, tucked against the safe's back wall, the corner of an envelope gone soft and yellow with age. Her own last name written across it, in a hand she'd never seen before. She didn't know yet what was in that envelope. She didn't know that in 6 days it would change how she understood every hard thing that had ever happened to her. Right now she only knew that her flashlight was flickering, that the wind through the broken roof had picked up, and that whatever she'd just found, nobody, not one living person, knew it was here but her. 6 days earlier, Wren Calloway owned a duffel bag, a phone with a cracked screen and no data plan, and $38 folded into her jacket pocket. She was 23 years old. She had aged out of the foster system at 18, with a garbage bag of clothes and a caseworker's business card she'd lost within a month. And in the 5 years since, she'd built something small and hers, a job at a diner, a room she rented above a hardware store, a life that wasn't much but was steady. Then the diner closed. Then the room went to someone who could pay first and last. She'd spent 11 nights sleeping in the extended stay lobby of a motel that let her use the bathroom if she bought coffee, and she'd started to understand, in a way she hadn't let herself before, that steady had never really belonged to her. It had just been borrowed. Can you imagine being 23 and doing the math on $38, trying to figure out how many days it bought you? She found the notice by accident, tacked to a corkboard outside the county clerk's office, where she'd gone to ask about emergency housing assistance she didn't qualify for. Forfeited property. Back taxes owed. Parcel 114B. Bellhaven Junction Depot. Minimum bid $6. Nobody wanted it. The listing said as much, almost apologetically. Structurally unsound. Condemned for rail use since the line closed. No utilities. No road access beyond a service track. $6 for a building nobody else would take. She almost walked past it. If you're watching this, and you've ever stood in front of a door you weren't sure you should walk through, that's exactly where she was standing. She paid the $6 in quarters. There was a clerk named Dot Simmons who processed the paperwork, and who paused halfway through stamping it to look up at Wren over her glasses. "You know it's just sitting there falling apart, right, honey? Nobody's touched that depot in 30 years. Wren said she knew. Dot Simmons had the look of someone who wanted to say more and decided against it, which Wren would only understand the reason for much later. The bus dropped her at a crossroads 2 miles out, because that was as close as the route went, and she walked the rest with her duffel bag cutting into her shoulder, and the sky doing that late afternoon thing where the light turns the color of a bruise healing. When the depot came into view, her first thought was that the county notice had been generous. The roof sagged over the east end like a shoulder given up on, windows gone to black holes or plywood. The platform out front had buckled where roots had pushed up through it, and the sign, Bellhaven Junction, faded but still legible, hung by one bolt, swinging faintly, though there wasn't much wind. She stood there a long moment with the strap of her bag cutting into her collarbone, and she let herself think, clearly, just once. I could turn around. There was a bus stop 2 miles back. There was, technically, the motel lobby if she hurried. But the motel had a checkout time she'd already missed twice this month, and $32 doesn't buy patience from people, only from buildings. So she didn't turn around. She climbed the sagging steps, put her hand flat against the door, swollen shut with damp, and pushed until it opened onto 40 years of settled dust and a silence that felt, oddly, less lonely than the motel lobby had. Inside, the ticket counter was still standing, its brass fittings gone green, a chalkboard schedule behind it with half-erased departure times from a decade she hadn't been born in. There was a bench along one wall with a name carved crookedly into the armrest, W. Hollis, that she noticed and then didn't think much about, not yet. That first night she slept on the bench with her jacket as a blanket, and somewhere past midnight she woke to a sound from the far end of the building. Not wind, something with weight to it, a settling or a shifting, and lay very still until it didn't happen again. By the third day she'd swept 2 rooms clean enough to stand in, found a hand pump out back that still, miraculously, drew water, and started keeping a list. In the back of a spiral notebook a hardware store clerk had given her for free, of everything that was broken and everything that might, with work, not be. She was 3 items into that list when Dot Simmons's nephew, a lanky teenager named Curtis, who ran deliveries for the general store 2 miles off, rode his bike past the depot, slowed down, and called out that his grandfather used to say the last station master here left owing money to half the county and secrets to the other half. Wren asked him what he meant. Curtis just shrugged, said he didn't know, said it was just something people said, and pedaled on before she could ask anything else. She thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. It was on the 4th night, prying at a floor panel that wouldn't sit flush no matter how she nailed it, that she found the outline of a hatch beneath the ticket counter, and beneath that, bolted into the joists, a squat iron safe nobody had mentioned in any legal notice, any county record, any conversation she'd had since arriving. She didn't touch it that night. She told herself she'd sleep on it. But she woke at 2 a.m. anyway, crowbar in hand, unable to stop thinking about a name carved into a bench, a nephew's half-answer, and a safe that had been waiting, patiently, for longer than she'd been alive to open it. Which brings us back to where we started, flashlight flickering, envelope in hand, and no idea yet whose name was written across the front of it, or why. Wren didn't open the envelope that night. She meant to. She sat on the station master's bench with it balanced on her knee, the flashlight propped against the safe's open door, and she got as far as running her thumb along the sealed edge before she stopped. Something about it felt like it deserved better light than a dying flashlight beam at 2 in the morning. So she wrapped it back in the oilcloth, tucked it into her duffel bag where it sat against her spine like a second spine, and didn't sleep again that night. By sunrise, she'd made a decision she couldn't entirely explain. She would fix one window before she read one word. It felt, obscurely, like something you did for a person before you accepted what they'd left you. The window she chose faced east, over what had once been the loading platform, and when she pried the plywood off it, morning light came through in a single dust-thick shaft that turned the whole ticket hall gold for about 10 minutes before the sun climbed past the frame. She stood in it a while. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that she'd felt something close to still. The depot, in daylight, was worse and better than she'd let herself see the first night. Worse. The east roof had a hole she could see sky through, and the back office floor gave alarmingly under her boot in one spot. Better. The bones of the place were good. Thick beams, real stone foundation, a wood stove in the corner that looked, with some coaxing, like it might still draw. Someone had built this to last, once. It had just been left alone too long. She was scraping rust off the hand pump when a truck came up the service track, slow, kicking gravel, and a man got out who looked to be somewhere past 60, broad through the shoulders, in the specific way of someone who'd spent a life doing things with his hands. He didn't introduce himself right away. He just looked at the depot, then at her, then back at the depot, like he was recalibrating something. Didn't think anyone'd actually take the county up on that listing, he said finally. Guess I surprised everybody, Wren said. He said his name was Hal Pruitt, that he ran the feed store 2 miles down, and that his father used to haul freight through this depot back when the line still ran. He didn't offer help. He didn't offer much of anything, standing there with his arms crossed, studying the sagging roofline, with the expression of a man doing silent math on how long before the whole thing came down on someone. You got people looking in on you out here? He asked. No, didn't figure. He said it without unkindness, just fact. And then he got back in his truck. Before he pulled off, though, he rolled the window down and added, almost like it cost him something, roof like that, first hard rain's gonna finish what time started. You want it to hold, you don't wait. Then he was gone, and Wren stood there turning the sentence over, because it sounded less like advice about a roof and more like something he knew from experience. She didn't have money for roofing supplies. She didn't have money for much of anything. So she did what she could with what she had. She cleared debris from the gutters with her bare hands. She found a tarp half buried in the equipment shed out back and dragged it up to cover the worst of the hole, and she spent the rest of the day hauling out 3 generations of trash, rusted signal lanterns, a stack of waterlogged ledgers she couldn't bring herself to throw away, a child's shoe that she found under the bench and set aside without knowing why it unsettled her. If you've ever taken on something that felt bigger than you were, you know the strange comfort of a task list, how it's easier to face one broken thing than the size of everything broken at once. It was mid-afternoon when Curtis showed up again, dropping his bike against the platform railing with the particular carelessness of a 14-year-old who's never once considered a bike might get scratched. He'd brought, unasked, half a loaf of his grandmother's bread and a jug of water, and he set both down on the ticket counter like it was nothing. Aunt Dot said to bring you this, he said, which Wren suspected was only partly true. She thanked him, and because he seemed inclined to linger, she asked him again about what he'd said before, about the last station master owing money to half the county and secrets to the other half. Curtis chewed his lip. I don't really know the whole thing. My granddad talks about it sometimes. Says the last guy who ran this place, Hollis, I think his name was, just disappeared one day. Didn't sell the place, didn't hand it off proper, just left. Granddad always says it like there's more to it, but he won't ever finish the story. Says it's not his to tell. Hollis, the same name carved into the bench arm, the same name, she was almost certain, that had been written across the front of the envelope, currently folded into her duffel bag. She asked Curtis if he knew anything else, anything about why Hollis left, or where he went, or whether he had family. Curtis just shrugged, said probably Dot would know more. She'd lived here her whole life, and then he was back on his bike and gone before Wren could decide whether to press. She spent the rest of the afternoon with that name sitting in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. By evening, the tarp was holding. The wood stove had thin grey smoke curling up out of its pipe for the first time in years, and Wren sat at the ticket counter with the notebook open, adding to her list by lamplight. Fix east roof properly. Ask Dot about Hollis. Find out what secrets to the other half of the county means. She underlined the last one twice before she caught herself doing it. She still hadn't opened the envelope. She told herself it was because she was tired, because the light was bad, because there'd be time tomorrow. The truer reason was smaller and harder to admit. As long as it stayed sealed, whatever was inside still belonged only to the person who'd written it, and to whatever hope had made him leave it here in the first place. The moment she broke that seal, it would belong to her too, and she wasn't sure yet if she was ready for that kind of inheritance. Outside, the wind had picked up again, working at the tarp's edges with a steady, patient insistence, like it intended to finish what it had started the night before. She went looking for Dot Simmons on the 5th morning, mostly because she'd run out of reasons not to. The walk to town took the better part of an hour, gravel giving way to cracked asphalt, the depot shrinking behind her until it was just a smudge of grey roofline against the tree line. Belhaven proper was smaller than she'd expected. A general store, a feed store with Pruitt's painted across the awning in letters gone thin with weather, a diner with 3 trucks parked outside it, and a squat brick building that turned out to be the county annex where Dot worked 3 days a week. Dot didn't seem surprised to see her. She looked up from behind a stack of manila folders, took in the state of Wren's boots and the rust stains on her hands, and said, "Well, you're still standing at least." "Barely," Wren admitted, and something about the honesty of it seemed to earn her a little ground, because Dot gestured her into the chair across from the desk, instead of keeping her at the counter. Wren asked her, carefully, about the name Hollis. Dot went quiet, in a way that told Wren more than words would have. She took her glasses off, cleaned them on her sleeve, a stalling gesture Wren was starting to recognize, and finally said, "Warren Hollis ran that depot near 40 years, back when the line was still hauling freight through twice a day. Good man, far as anybody knew, kept to himself. Never married. No kids that anyone knew of." She paused. Then one year just stopped showing up. Depot went quiet. County took it eventually, for the taxes, same as they took it from you. Nobody ever really got the whole story on why he left, or where he went. Do you know if he had any family? Anybody who might have, I don't know, come looking for the place? After? Dot's face did something complicated. There was talk, way back, of a sister. Nobody I ever knew met her. She put her glasses back on, and the conversation, Wren understood, was closing whether she wanted it to or not. You want my advice, honey, and you don't have to take it. Some things get left behind on purpose. Not every locked door's begging to be opened. Wren didn't tell her about the safe. She wasn't sure why not, except that the sentence landed somewhere she wasn't ready to examine. If you've ever asked a question and gotten an answer that only made you want to ask 3 more, you know exactly the itch Wren was carrying on the walk back. She stopped at the diner before she left town, more for the promise of coffee than out of hunger, and it was there she met the first person in Belhaven who didn't bother softening anything. A woman about Wren's mother's age, apron-stained, name-tag reading Beth, took one look at Wren's boots and said, without much warmth, "You're the one who bought the depot." "That's right. For $6. Beth said it like an accusation. "My husband bid $400 on that parcel 8 years back. Wanted to turn it into storage units. County wouldn't release it on account of some lien nobody could explain. And you walk in and get it for pocket change." Wren didn't have a good answer for that, so she didn't try to give one. She just said she was sorry it hadn't worked out for him, and paid for her coffee, and left before it could go anywhere worse. But the word lien followed her out the door, and sat with her the whole walk home, because nobody, not the clerk's office, not the listing, not Dot, had mentioned any lien to her. She was 3/4 of the way back to the depot, turning that word over, when Hal Pruitt's truck slowed alongside her on the service road, and he leaned across to roll the window down. "Heard you went into town," he said, which meant word traveled fast in a place this small. "You want to ride the rest of the way, or you enjoying the walk?" She took the ride. It gave her a chance to ask him, straight out, whether he knew anything about a lien on the depot property or about Warren Hollis's sister. Hal's jaw did something tight. "There's no lien I ever heard of. Beth's husband likes a story where somebody else got cheated out of something that was rightfully his. Don't put much stock in it." He was quiet a moment, driving, before he added, "As for a sister, I couldn't tell you. My father might have known. He and Hollis went back a ways." He glanced at her, sideways, like he was deciding something. "You planning on staying out there through winter?" "That's the plan." "That roof won't make it to winter the way it sits." He didn't offer to help, but when he dropped her at the depot's turnoff, he said, almost like an afterthought, that he had some old roofing tin sitting unused behind the feed store, taking up space, and if she ever wanted to haul it off his hands, he wouldn't charge her for it. It wasn't much, but it was the first time since she'd arrived that anyone in Belhaven had offered her something without her having to ask first. That evening, back at the depot, she finally sat down at the ticket counter with the lamp lit, the wood stove ticking as it cooled, and the envelope in front of her. She'd fixed a window. She'd hauled out 3 generations of trash. She'd earned, she told herself, the right to know what was inside. The seal gave easily, softened by decades of damp, and inside was a single folded sheet of paper, the handwriting careful and slightly old-fashioned, the ink faded to brown. She unfolded it by lamplight, and the first line alone was enough to make her sit very still. "If you're reading this, then the depot found its way to someone who needed it as much as I once did, and I expect you have questions about the sister I never told a soul I had." Wren read it twice before she let herself breathe. "If you're reading this, then the depot found its way to someone who needed it as much as I once did, and I expect you have questions about the sister I never told a soul I had." Wren read the letter through twice, then a third time, slower, letting each line settle before she moved to the next. "Her name was Iris, younger than me by 6 years, and stubborn in a way that used to worry our mother sick. She left home at 17 chasing something she never did explain to my satisfaction, and for a long while I let my pride keep me from writing to ask where she'd gone. By the time I swallowed that pride, I couldn't find her. I spent 20 years running this depot and looking for my sister in equal measure, and I never managed either one all the way to where I wanted. What's in that safe isn't mine, not really. It's what I saved across those 20 years, meaning to hand to her the day she walked back through that door. Money I never let myself spend on comfort I didn't feel I'd earned while she was still out there somewhere. Cold, however she was cold, she never came. I'm an old man now, writing this some nights when my hands still work well enough to hold a pen, and I've made my peace that she may be gone, or may simply have built a life that never circled back this way. And either is all right, so long as she was warm somewhere. So here is what I want you to understand. Whoever you are, however you came to be standing in my ticket hall, the money was only ever meant to be a foundation, never the point of the thing. The point was always the chance to build something that lasts, on ground that costs you almost nothing but asks everything of you in return. That's what this depot gave me once, when I was younger, and had nothing either. I'm passing it on. Take the foundation, build something true on it. And if you ever do meet a woman near my age with my sister's stubborn chin, tell her the door was always open, and I never once stopped listening for her step on that platform. W. Hollis Wren set the letter down with hands that weren't quite steady, and for a long moment the depot was silent, except for the wood stove ticking and the wind working at the tarp overhead. She'd expected, if she was honest, that the letter would be about her, some stranger's quiet blessing on a stranger's quiet, fresh start. She hadn't expected a sister. She hadn't expected 20 years of a locked drawer and a door left open for someone who never walked back through it. If you've ever kept something for a person who might never come back for it, you already understand exactly the weight Wren was holding. She went back to the safe that night and finished what she'd started 4 nights before, carefully, this time by better light. Beneath the oilcloth-wrapped bundle was more money than she'd let herself imagine. Bound stacks, older bills mixed with newer ones. 20 years of a man's careful, patient saving. Beneath that, a small tin box holding a woman's silver locket, tarnished nearly black, and a folded railway schedule from decades back with a single date circled in fading pencil. The day Wren would come to understand that Warren Hollis had waited on this exact platform, and Iris hadn't come. She didn't count the money that night. It felt, somehow, beside the point. What she did instead was sit with the locket a long while, turning it over, running her thumb across the tarnish, thinking about Dot's careful evasions, and Hal's tightened jaw whenever the sister came up, and Beth's talk of a lien nobody official could confirm. And a small, cold thought took root that she couldn't quite shake. What if somebody in this town knew more about Iris Hollis than they'd told her? What if the lien Beth's husband swore he'd hit wasn't a rumor at all, but the edge of a family dispute nobody local wanted, dragged back into daylight? She didn't have proof of anything, but she had a name now, and a locket, and a date circled in pencil, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Belhaven Junction, the depot's silence didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting on her to finish something somebody else had started and couldn't. The next morning she walked into town again, locket in her pocket, and asked Dot Simmons a different question than the one she'd asked before. Did Warren Hollis's sister ever have a last name that wasn't Hollis? Married, maybe? Dot's hands went still over her folders. Where'd you hear that name? I found a letter. Dot didn't answer right away. She looked at Wren for a long moment, weighing something, and then said, quiet enough that the clerk at the next desk wouldn't catch it, "You'd best come by after 5, when I'm off the clock." There's things I can say as Dot Simmons that I can't say sitting at this desk. Dot's house sat 2 streets back from the annex, a small frame place with a porch swing that had clearly seen 40 years of use. She had Wren in a kitchen chair with a glass of iced tea before she said much of anything, and when she finally did speak, she spoke like someone setting down a weight she'd been carrying longer than she wanted. Iris Hollis married a man named Ted Calloway, Dot said. Moved off 2 counties over, far as I ever heard tell. Wren's hand went still around the glass. Calloway. That means something to you. It did. It was her own last name, a name she'd only ever known from a birth certificate and a caseworker's file. A father she'd never met, and a mother who died before Wren was old enough to ask questions worth answering. She'd never once connected it to anything, because there had never been anything to connect it to. Until now. I think, Wren said slowly, that might be my name too. Dot studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that recalibrates everything it's looking at, and then she said, quiet, well, that would explain why that depot let you in without a fight. If you've ever gone looking for one answer and found out the answer was you the whole time, you know the particular kind of quiet that follows. Dot didn't have proof, not really. Just an old name, a family that had scattered decades ago, and a resemblance she said she hadn't let herself say out loud until just now, something in the set of Wren's jaw that matched a photograph she vaguely remembered from years back. It wasn't certainty, it was a thread, thin and possibly leading nowhere, and Wren walked back to the depot that evening, carrying it carefully, the way you carry something that might turn out to be nothing. She didn't tell Hal, not yet. She didn't tell Curtis. She sat with it, the way she'd learned to sit with things that mattered, and let the work of the following days absorb some of the weight of it. The roofing tin from Pruitt's feed store took 2 full days to haul, sheet by sheet, on a handcart Hal lent her without being asked twice. He showed up on the 3rd day without announcement, climbed the ladder before she could argue, and spent an afternoon showing her how to overlap the sheets so rain wouldn't find the seams. He didn't talk much while he worked. When he did, it was short and practical. Where to nail, how tight, what happens if you rush it. But partway through the afternoon, unprompted, he said, "My father used to say Warren Hollis was the only man in this county who never once asked what he was owed." He hammered a nail home before he added, "Guess it runs in the family, whatever's left of it." It was the closest he'd come to admitting he suspected what Dot had told her. The work was hard in a way Wren hadn't fully braced for. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again in new places. Her shoulders ached with a soreness that woke her at night. She put a nail through her palm on the 2nd day and had to stop and bind it and keep going anyway, because the tarp wouldn't hold through another storm, and the sky to the west had started looking the wrong kind of grey. Curtis started showing up most afternoons after his deliveries, not offering much skill, but plenty of company. And once, hauling scrap wood, he mentioned, casually, the way 14-year-olds mention things, that his grandfather had a box of old depot photographs somewhere, if she ever wanted to see what the place looked like back when. She wanted to see them. She added it to the list. By the end of the week, the east roof was patched tight, tin gleaming raw silver against the weathered grey of the rest, and Wren stood on the platform below it, in the last gold light of evening, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could name. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it, earned, steady. That steadiness lasted about a day. She found the rot on a Tuesday morning, running her hand along a support beam in the back office while she planned where to hang shelving, and felt the wood give under her fingers like wet cardboard. She pulled her hand back and looked closer, and what she saw made her stomach drop clean through the floor. The beam wasn't just soft at the surface. It was soft, 3 inches deep, black with old water damage, and it was one of 4 beams holding up the entire back half of the building. The same half where the safe, the letter, and everything else she'd found were sitting. She climbed down carefully, checked the other 3 beams, and found 2 of them nearly as bad. The wind picked up outside, working at the new tin roof with a low, testing rattle, and somewhere off to the west, the sky had gone the particular bruised color that Hal had warned her, weeks ago now, tended to mean something was coming. Wren spent the rest of that Tuesday doing the math on 4 rotted beams and a storm she couldn't stop, and none of the numbers came out in her favor. She didn't have the money to hire anyone. Not real money. Not money she was willing to touch. Because somewhere in the last week, the cash in that safe had stopped feeling like hers to spend and started feeling like something she was only holding on to for someone. She had a handcart, a borrowed truck's worth of goodwill she didn't want to spend all at once, and roughly 2 days before the sky made good on what it had been threatening. She went to Hal first, because by now that felt like the natural thing to do, and found him behind the feed store, loading sacks of grain onto a flatbed for a delivery that couldn't wait. He listened to her describe the rot without stopping what he was doing, which she'd learned by now was just how he listened. And when she finished, he set the sack down and said, "Show me." He drove out that afternoon, climbed under the back office with a flashlight of his own, and came back out with his jaw set in a way she recognized from the sister conversation weeks before. "It's bad," he said. "Worse than bad, honestly. You shore those up wrong, or too slow, that whole back half comes down. Safe, letter, all of it, straight into the crawl space." He wiped his hands on his jeans. "I can get you sistered beams and jacks, but I can't get them here before that storm hits." "Not by myself." "Then what do? We do what we can tonight, and we pray the rest holds till morning. If you've ever had to choose between doing something imperfectly and not doing it at all, you understand the particular kind of fear Wren carried into that evening. They worked until well past dark, Hal directing, Wren hauling, both of them jacking temporary supports under the worst of the beams, with whatever lumber scraps and cinder blocks they could scrounge from the equipment shed. It wasn't a fix. Hal said so plainly, more than once. It was a stall, a bought handful of hours, and both of them knew it. Curtis showed up unannounced around 8, having heard from his aunt that something was wrong out at the depot, and Wren almost sent him home before she saw the look on his face. A 14-year-old trying very hard to be useful to people he'd decided, on his own, mattered to him. She let him hold the flashlight and hand up nails, and didn't send him away again. It started raining a little after 10. Not the storm yet, just its outrider, cold and steady, finding every gap the tarp hadn't quite covered. Hal made them stop working the beams once the ground turned to mud under the jacks, said forcing it further in the dark was more likely to hurt someone than help the building, and told Wren flatly that she wasn't sleeping in that back half tonight. She didn't argue. She dragged a mattress she'd salvaged from the equipment shed into the front ticket hall, farthest from the compromised beams, and lay awake, listening to rain find the tin roof Hal had helped her hang only days before. A sound that should have been comforting, proof the repair was holding, but instead felt like a countdown to whatever the real storm would do to the half of the building it hadn't reached yet. Somewhere around midnight, unable to sleep, she took out Warren Hollis's letter again and read it by lamplight for what must have been the 10th time, lingering this time on the line about the door always being open, never once stopped listening for a footstep on the platform. She thought about Iris Hollis, her grandmother, if Dot's thread held true, a woman who'd left home at 17 and never come back, whether by choice or circumstance, or something in between nobody living seemed to fully know. She thought too about her own mother, dead before Wren was old enough to ask a single real question, and wondered, for the first time, whether that leaving had run in the family the way Hal had half-joked the giving did. The full storm hit a little after 2 in the morning, and it hit hard. Wind that found every loose board in the building and rattled it like a warning. Rain coming sideways hard enough that it found its way in under the front door, despite the towel she'd shoved against the gap. She lay on the salvaged mattress, listening to the back half of the building groan, under the weight of wind and water both, the temporary jacks, somewhere in the dark, holding or not holding. She had no way to tell which from where she was, and there was nothing to do but wait it out and hope 4 strangers' worth of scrap lumber was enough to buy Warren Hollis's inheritance one more night. Somewhere past 3, over the wind, she heard it, a deep, groaning crack from the back of the building, followed by a crash that shook dust down from the rafters over her head. Wren was up before she'd finished waking, mattress abandoned, moving toward the sound before her mind had caught up to what it might mean. The back office was dark and full of settling dust, and her flashlight beam, when she finally got it working, showed her the worst of it right away. One of the jacked supports had given, and with it, a section of floor joist had dropped 6 inches, tilting the back corner of the room at an angle that hadn't been there an hour before. The safe, bolted deep into the original joists, older and sturdier than the failed support, had held its position, but the floor around it had buckled, and a crack now ran up the back wall from floor to ceiling, wide enough that rain was coming through it in a thin, steady sheet. It could have been so much worse. She made herself hold on to that, hands shaking, flashlight beam wandering to the safe and finding it intact, the ledger stack and the small tin box she'd left inside, still sitting where she'd left them, undisturbed by 6 inches of falling floor. She didn't try to fix anything in the dark. She couldn't have if she'd wanted to. The remaining jacks were groaning under redistributed weight, and putting her own weight anywhere near that corner felt like tempting a second collapse. So she did the only thing left to do. She sat on the tilted floor's edge, out of the room but close enough to hear if anything else gave, and waited out the rest of the storm, listening to rain find its way through a crack in a wall, a dead man had built to last. If you've ever sat up all night keeping vigil over something you weren't sure would survive till morning, you know exactly the particular exhaustion Wren carried into dawn. Hal arrived before 7, took one look at the tilted corner and the crack running up the wall, and didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, it wasn't reassurance. "This is past what you and me can shore up with scrap lumber," he said. "You need real jacks, real beams, and probably somebody who knows foundations better than I do. That's money, Wren. Money you don't have, unless," he stopped himself, "unless I use what's in the safe." He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. They both stood there looking at the crack in the wall, and Wren felt something close in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not fear, exactly, but something like grief. The recognition that the money Warren Hollis had spent 20 years refusing to spend on his own comfort might now have to be spent just to keep the roof over the very safe he'd kept it in. She thought about the letter. The money was only ever meant to be a foundation, never the point of the thing. She hadn't understood, reading it the first time, how literally that sentence might end up being true. She spent the morning making calls from the payphone outside the general store, the only phone she had access to, and came back with 2 numbers for contractors, 2 counties over, both of whom quoted more than the safe's contents were likely to cover once she'd actually counted the bills, which she still hadn't done, because counting it had felt, until this exact morning, like something she wasn't ready to do. She counted it that afternoon, alone, at the ticket counter, with Hal's estimate folded next to her for comparison. It came to just enough, barely, and only if nothing else went wrong, which nothing ever seemed to entirely refrain from doing out here. Dot came by that evening, having heard about the collapse from Curtis, who'd heard it from Hal, in the particular way news traveled in a town this size. She stood in the doorway of the tilted back office a long moment, taking in the crack in the wall, the safe still bolted stubborn and intact in the buckled floor, and said, "Quiet, 40 years, and that safe still won't let go of what he put in it. Man built things to last. I'll give him that." Then she said something that stopped Wren cold. "You know, there's a second thing I never told you, when you asked before, about Iris." "What's that?" "She didn't just leave home at 17 and vanish into thin air. There was a falling out, bad one, between her and Warren before she left. I don't know the whole shape of it, but my mother always said Warren blamed himself for something he never would say out loud, and I always wondered if that's why he spent 20 years keeping that door open the way he did, not just hoping she'd come back." Dot looked at the crack in the wall, then back at Wren, trying to make up for whatever he thought he'd done wrong. Wren sat with that a long moment, the rain-damp letter still folded in her jacket pocket, and thought about a man who'd spent 2 decades listening for a footstep on a platform that never came, carrying some unspoken guilt she now had no way of asking him about directly, only the fragments other people had kept, carefully, all these years, waiting, it seemed, for someone to finally come asking. The contractor came out 2 days later, a quiet, sun-weathered man named Roy Aldridge who Hal vouched for personally, and confirmed what Hal had already suspected. The foundation itself was sound, thick fieldstone that would outlast all of them, but 4 of the joists needed full replacement, and the back wall needed rebuilding from the crack up. It was 3 days' work, minimum, with the right materials and an extra set of hands. Wren paid him from the safe. She counted out the bills herself, in front of Hal and Roy both, because it felt important somehow that this transaction happen in daylight, witnessed, rather than in secret, the way everything else about that money had existed until now. Her hands didn't shake this time. It felt less like spending an inheritance and more like finishing something Warren Hollis had started and never gotten the chance to see through. If you've ever taken something meant for safekeeping and finally understood what it was actually for, you know the particular relief in that moment. The work went faster than expected, partly because Curtis recruited 2 friends from town who showed up on the second day, asking, a little sheepishly, if there was anything they could do to help. Word having spread, the way it does in small places, about the girl fixing up the old depot with her own hands and pocket change. By the third afternoon, there were 5 people working the back office, and Beth from the diner showed up unannounced around noon with a cooler of sandwiches and lemonade, setting it down without much comment beyond, "Figured you all forgot to eat." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, for the sharpness of their first meeting, but it was something adjacent to one, and Wren let it be enough. She found the second letter on the 4th day, wedged behind the tin box in the safe where she hadn't thought to check before. Smaller, folded tighter, addressed not to whoever inherited the depot, but simply, "Iris, if you ever come home." She almost didn't open it. It felt, briefly, like it belonged to someone else even more than the first one had. But Dot's words from days before were still sitting with her. A falling out, Warren blamed himself, and something in her needed to know the shape of it, needed to understand the guilt a man had apparently carried for 20 years, listening for a footstep that never came. The letter was short. "Iris, I said something to you the night you left that I have spent every year since wishing I could take back. I told you that you were choosing to throw your life away, and I said it because I was scared for you, not because I believed it, though I understand now that fear dressed up as certainty does just as much damage either way. I was your older brother, and I was supposed to make you feel like you had somewhere safe to come back to, and instead I made you feel like you'd have to prove something before you were welcome. That was never true. It was never going to be true. If you're reading this, know that the door was never locked because of anything you did. It was only ever locked because I couldn't bear the silence any other way. Come home. There is no test to pass first. There never was." Wren read it twice, then folded it carefully and sat with it a long while in the half-rebuilt back office, sawdust still settling in the afternoon light, and understood something she hadn't fully let herself see until that exact moment. Warren Hollis hadn't just lost a sister. He'd driven her away with fear dressed as certainty, and then spent 20 years trying to undo a single sentence he could never take back, building a door that stayed open, a fund that stayed untouched, a whole quiet life organized around an apology he never got to give. It didn't fully explain why Iris had never come back, or what had become of her after Belhaven, or how a granddaughter she likely never mentioned had ended up here by pure accident of bad luck and a $6 county listing. But it explained the ache underneath everything else, why the letter to whoever inherited this place had insisted, twice, that the money was never the point. She thought about her own mother, gone before Wren was old enough to ask a single real question, and wondered, with an ache she hadn't expected, whether some version of that same fear, dressed as certainty, or dressed as anything else, had shaped choices in her own family longer than just one generation. She showed the second letter to Dot that evening. Dot read it standing at the ticket counter, and when she finished, she was quiet a long moment before she said, "Careful, there's one more thing I know, that I never told you, because I wasn't sure it was mine to tell. My mother kept in touch with Iris for a few years after she left town. Just letters, nothing regular. Far as I know, she settled somewhere and had a family of her own eventually." Dot looked up. "I never knew a name for the family, but if you're who I think you might be, Wren, there might be more of this story left to find than just what's in that safe." Curtis's grandfather's name was Ellis Boone, and he lived in a small house at the edge of town with a wood stove much like the one Wren had gotten working at the depot, and a shoebox of old photographs he'd apparently been promising his grandson he'd dig out one of these days for longer than Curtis could remember. He dug it out the following afternoon, once Curtis explained, with the particular bluntness of a 14-year-old, that it was actually important this time. Ellis Boone was closer to 90 than 80, sharp-eyed despite it, and he went through the photographs slowly, narrating each one in a voice that had clearly told these stories before, just never to anyone who'd needed to hear them this badly. Depot photographs, freight cars. A young Warren Hollis standing on the platform in a station master's cap, serious-faced even then. And near the bottom of the box, a photograph of two young people, a boy who was unmistakably Warren, and a girl beside him, maybe 16, with a chin Wren recognized instantly because she saw a version of it in the mirror every morning. "That's Iris," Ellis said, without needing to be asked. "Best I recall, this was taken not long before she left. My own mother was friendly with theirs. Small towns, everybody tangled up in everybody else's business, one way or another." He turned the photograph over. On the back, in a careful, girlish hand, Iris and Warren, before everything. Wren held the locket from the safe up next to the photograph, and there was no mistaking it. The same tarnished silver piece, small and oval, visible even in the faded photo around the 16-year-old Iris's neck. If you've ever held two pieces of proof side by side and felt a question you'd carried for weeks finally close, you understand exactly what settled in Wren's chest in that moment. Dot's mother's old letters took another 2 days to track down. Boxed in Dot's attic, brittle with age, most of them brief and practical, the kind of correspondence two women exchange across distance without much ceremony. But one, dated some 15 years back, mentioned Iris by her married name, Calloway, and mentioned, almost in passing, a granddaughter Iris doted on, a girl not yet school-aged at the time, whose photograph Iris had apparently sent along, and which Dot's mother had, with the thoroughness of someone who never threw anything away, kept folded inside the letter itself. The photograph was small, square-edged, faded at the corners. A toddler on a porch step, squinting into the sun, a woman beside her, with silver hair and the unmistakable Hollis chin, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Wren didn't recognize herself in it, not exactly. She'd been too young to remember being photographed. But she recognized the porch. It matched, distantly, a memory she'd always assumed belonged to nowhere in particular. A summer visit somewhere with grass that smelled like clover, before her mother's death had scattered what remained of that side of the family into silence and foster paperwork. She was Iris Hollis Calloway's granddaughter, Warren Hollis's great-niece. The depot hadn't found her by $6 accident at all. It had found its way, however roundabout, back to blood, the way Warren had perhaps hoped, in some quiet corner of himself, it eventually might. The rebuilt back office was finished by the end of that week. New joists, a solid wall, the crack sealed and painted over, the safe reset into a floor that would hold it for another 40 years if it needed to. Hal stood in the doorway when the last board went up, arms crossed the way they'd been the very first day he pulled up in his truck, and said, "Guess it runs deeper than the giving after all." "Guess it runs in the blood." Wren invited the whole loose collection of people who'd helped her. Hal, Curtis, Dot, Ellis, even Beth, who came bearing a pie this time, instead of an accusation, out to the depot for a meal on the newly repaired platform, the first real gathering the building had hosted in longer than any of them could say. She told them, over food, what she'd learned, the whole shape of it, Warren and Iris, and the falling out, and the 20 years of an open door. Dot cried a little, unashamed. Ellis said he was glad he'd lived long enough to see the box of photographs finally matter to somebody. Curtis, typically unsentimental, mostly asked if this meant Wren was rich now, and laughed when she told him not exactly, not the way he meant. That night, once everyone had gone, Wren sat alone on the platform with the locket around her own neck for the first time, looking out at a depot that no longer looked abandoned by anyone. Roof solid, walls sound, lamplight in the windows for anyone passing on the service road to see. She thought about Warren Hollis waiting on this same platform for a footstep that never came, and she thought, with something like peace, that in a strange roundabout way it finally had. Autumn came to Belhaven Junction the way it always had, if the depot's old bones could be believed. Early frost silvering the platform boards, the light going long and gold in the afternoons. The sound of wind through the roofline changed now, no longer a warning but just weather, passing through a building that had finally learned to hold against it. Wren spent the money carefully, in the months that followed. Enough to finish the repairs Warren Hollis's roof and beams still needed. Enough, eventually, to turn the old ticket hall into something new. Not a depot anymore, not really, since the line had been gone for decades and wasn't coming back, but a small general storefront that sold preserves and firewood and the kind of practical goods a rural crossroads still needed. With the original chalkboard schedule left up behind the counter, unerased, because some things were worth keeping even once their original purpose had passed. She kept the rest of the money exactly where Warren Hollis's letter had told her to put it, not spent on comfort, but set aside as a foundation, the way he'd meant it. When a family 2 towns over lost their barn to a lightning fire that winter, Wren was the first to show up with lumber and a check that covered what insurance didn't, and she told them, when they asked why a stranger would do such a thing, only that someone had once done the same for her, in a manner of speaking, and that she was just passing along what she'd been given. If you've ever been handed something you didn't earn and felt the weight of figuring out what you owed the world in return, you already understand exactly what Wren was doing with that money, and why. Dot came out most Sundays after that, initially for tea, and eventually because it had simply become habit, the kind of found family arrangement neither of them named out loud, but both understood plainly. Hal fixed what needed fixing without being asked, same as he always had, though he'd started bringing his own thermos now instead of just his tools, staying long enough for conversation he'd have once considered unnecessary. Curtis, older by a single winter but somehow more sure of himself for it, started talking about apprenticing with Roy Aldridge come spring, learning the kind of hands-on trade that had rebuilt the depot's back office. And Wren found herself, without quite planning it, becoming the kind of person younger kids in town brought their hard questions to, the way Hal and Dot had once, reluctantly, become that for her. It was Curtis, in fact, who brought her the closest thing to a legacy recipient the story would offer. A girl a year behind him in school, 16, and recently orphaned in a car accident that had taken both her parents, staying with an aunt who didn't have much room or patience for a grieving teenager. Curtis brought her out to the depot one Saturday, half apologetic, saying only that she didn't have anywhere else that felt like it wanted her around. Wren recognized something in the girl's face she remembered from her own reflection, 5 years back, in the extended stay motel bathroom mirror. She didn't say anything grand. She just handed the girl a broom and asked if she wanted to help sweep out the old equipment shed, the way Wren herself had once been handed nothing but a task list and told, implicitly, that she was capable of more than her circumstances suggested. She never went looking for Iris Hollis Calloway's full story beyond what the old letters offered. Whether her grandmother was still alive somewhere, whether there were other Calloways scattered across some county she'd never visited. Some doors, she'd come to understand, stayed open not because you walked through them right away, but because knowing they existed was its own kind of foundation. She kept the second letter, Iris, if you ever come home, framed on the wall behind the counter where anyone could read it, unashamed, because Warren Hollis had spent 20 years hoping someone would eventually find it, and hiding it now felt like betraying the very patience that had built it. On the 1-year anniversary of the day she'd paid $6 in quarters for a condemned depot nobody else wanted, Wren stood on the platform at dusk, the storefront lamps warm behind her, the sign, Bellhaven Junction, repainted now, still legible for another 40 years at least, hanging solid on both its bolts. She thought about Warren Hollis, a man who'd spent 2 decades listening for a footstep that never came, and about the strange roundabout patience of blood and chance that had finally sent one, hers, echoing across that same platform instead. If there's one thing this whole story taught her, it's that the foundation you're given rarely looks like much at first. $6, a condemned building, a stranger's guilt turned patient hope across 20 quiet years. What you build on it is the only part that was ever really up to you. So if you're watching this tonight, wherever you are, however small the thing is that you've been handed to start with, I hope you'll stay a while and build something true on it too. And if this story found you the way this depot found me, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Make sure you're subscribed, because there's another story just like this one waiting for you next week.